Within the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, where light dances on glazed roof tiles, lies a world of thousands of women imprisoned under the guise of glory. They are called concubines, yet in truth, they are nothing more than chess pieces in a game of power played solely by the emperor. Each one possesses her own beauty, carefully selected from across the empire, but, once stepping into the inner court, neither beauty nor virtue guarantees anything beyond interminable waiting. They have no right to choose whom they love, nor are they permitted to express personal emotions. Their lives are confined to a rigid framework of rituals, rules, and the watchful eyes of eunuchs, palace maids, and other women in that system. Beneath the facade of luxury exists a dark world where a person's entire existence is reduced to a single choice, to be selected or not. Night after night, the emperor selects a concubine for the ritual known as visitation. This process is not one of affection or romantic desire, it is a political ceremony of control. One carefully carved wooden name tag drawn from a handful can turn an unknown concubine into the future mother of an heir or plunge her into a vortex of rivalry, envy, and peril. For the women of the harem, being chosen is both fate and conspiracy. Some yearn for it as their only path to escape obscurity and anonymity. Others fear it with haunting dread, knowing that each selection gambles with honor, body, and life. One misstep wearing jewelry into the sleeping quarters, revealing an emotion, even emitting an untimely sound can bring severe punishment, demotion, confinement, or exile to the cold palace, condemned to a life of solitude and regret. Not everyone survives this lawless game. In that world, no one cares about their dreams or grief. They are not allowed to live as normal human beings, but exist like automatons, offered when needed and discarded when their use has ended. Above all, they learn to accept that in the Qing harem, living is not necessarily good, and being loved is nothing but a fantasy. In the Qing harem, intimacy between emperor and concubine is never simply personal, it's a state ritual, integrated into the machinery of governance, where both body and emotion are governed with precision and severity. Behind the romantic images, history often portrays the emperor choosing a beauty for the night is a chilling, strict, dehumanizing sequence of procedures. Each evening, after dinner, eunuchs present rows of small wooden name tags bearing the concubines' names. The emperor chooses one randomly or intentionally. Beneath dim lantern light, the choice resembles a lottery but carries grave consequences. The chosen name initiates a process of total control. From that instant, every move, every breath is dictated. Once notified, the concubine must undergo preparation, a thorough bath using fragrant water, hairstyling, perfume not to allure, but to ensure she is clean and worthy of the Son of Heaven. Yet after bathing, she is forbidden from dressing or adorning herself. Instead, she must wrap herself fully in a blanket like a carefully packaged object intended for presentation. When eunuchs arrive, she is carried still silent and wrapped to the emperor's bed. From that moment, she is not allowed to walk upright, but must crawl from the foot of the bed upward, symbolizing out submission. This gesture is not symbolic alone, it confirms her inferiority and voicelessness, marking her as property and servant. Throughout the intimacy, absolute silence is mandatory. No heavy breathing, no moans, no emotional display, pleasure or pain alike. Any sound from her is considered an offense to the emperor. A single slip, a cough, a breath too loud can result in immediate punishment, demotion, exile, or permanent removal from the selection pool. Jewelry pins, bracelets, rings are strictly forbidden, ostensibly for security, to prevent assassination attempts, but ultimately to enforce out nudity of power. Nothing may make her more beautiful or distinctive beyond her natural state. In that moment, her body ceases to belong to her, it becomes the emperor's property, symbolic of imperial sovereignty. Around them, 12 eunuchs stand silent, vigilant, moving, quiet, yet poised to intervene if anything deviates from protocol. When the appointed hour arrives, and the emperor does not end the ritual himself, the eunuch outside strikes the door, calls out loudly, reminding him time is up. If no response follows, the knocking intensifies a message that even emperors must abide by established rules. When the ritual concludes, she wraps herself again in the blanket, crawls back as she came, and is carried back to her palace. Her emotions, bodily trauma, or mental turmoil, none of it finds voice. The encounter ends like a shift change. No tenderness, no affection, no guarantee of a next time. Tomorrow, another wooden tag, another unknown fate. Thus, the ritual of visitation, once seen as the highest honor in the harem, is in truth a method of absolute control, reducing women to bundled bodies stripped of identity, emotion, and human rights. A sanctified rite, on the surface but beneath, a means to reinforce imperial authority over powerless human beings. If the emperor is the center of all power within the harem, then the eunuchs are the invisible arms executing the machine's precise control. Castrated from youth to serve in the palace, these men became silent and terrifying overseers of the concubines. They hold the keys to power, the emperor's favor, and the humiliation of countless women within the Forbidden City. Each imperial night, once the act of intimacy concluded, a short but immensely powerful question would be spoken, issued not by the emperor, but by the overseeing eunuch: shall the dragon seed be kept? This wasn't merely about whether to retain semen. It was a question about the future, about power, about the potential of giving birth to a royal heir, a possible little prince. If the emperor nodded, the order to retain the seed became a life-altering opportunity for the woman who had just stepped out of the dragon bed. Her name would be recorded, her health monitored. Every step she took would be watched over to protect the unborn child that had yet to even form. But if the emperor said no, everything changed instantly, and the one to wield the scalpel of fate wasn't a doctor, but the eunuch. The process of not keeping the dragon seed was one of the most brutal and controversial aspects of the imperial harem. The eunuch would press forcefully on an acupoint in the lower abdomen, then continuously massage it to force the semen out, aiming to prevent conception. It resembled a medical procedure, but its intent was not care. It stemmed from a terrifying obsession with power and the absolute reproductive control imposed by the imperial court. For many concubines, this was the most horrifying moment after every intimate night. They had just endured a ritual of silence and obedience, barely recovered emotionally or physically, only to face the cold intrusion of a man who was neither husband nor physician, just someone with the authority to decide for them whether their body had permission to conceive. Worse, some eunuchs abused this moment. They would intentionally prolong the procedure, taking advantage of the opportunity to touch the concubines under the guise of duty. They didn't need to be violent, just extending contact with sensitive parts of the body, under the cover of legitimacy, was enough to make the women feel deeply humiliated. The eunuchs knew these women would not dare cry out. Even a baseless accusation could cost them everything: the emperor's favor, their position, or even their lives. In a harem run on silence and scheming, a woman suffering, especially when it came from neutral actors like eunuchs, was of no concern to anyone. The bitter irony was clear. Those men who no longer had the ability to father children were the ones granted the most access to women's wombs. They had no sexual desires like other men, but that didn't stop them from becoming cruel or even perverse. The physical pain from forced expulsion of semen was only the surface of the iceberg. What truly crushed the concubines was the spiritual violation, the absolute stripping away of bodily autonomy. They had no choice, no voice. Some concubines tried to resist, to avoid or refuse the procedure, but those were rare. In the palace, refusal wasn't just defiance. It was considered blasphemy, betrayal, even treason. They understood, if they stirred trouble, a eunuch's single word could exile them to the cold palace, or erase their names from the emperor's memory forever. So, many chose silence. They clenched their teeth and endured the violation because even the slimmest chance of pregnancy was still hope. In the harem, a woman only had a voice when she bore a child. Without one, she was merely a shadow, a ceremonial offering, placed and forgotten, living within crimson walls that offered no warmth. In the Qing Dynasty harem, where each imperial summons seemed like an honor bestowed by the Son of Heaven, the reality was far more terrifying. Each night, the emperor would select a wooden plaque engraved with the concubine's name. When a name was drawn from that cold pile, onlookers might smile, but the chosen woman might break into a cold sweat. For in the harem, honor and ruin were often separated by a single breath. If called upon during her menstrual period, an entirely natural female occurrence, it could become a death sentence. In the eyes of the Confucian court, menstrual blood was deemed impure, and allowing the emperor to touch such a body was seen as an unforgivable offense. She could be accused of defiling the royal flesh, of desecrating the mandate of heaven, and punished accordingly, banished to the cold palace, or even executed in silence. No one asked, how could a woman possibly control her menstrual cycle? No one defended her. It was just a biological accident. In that world, where every act was politicized, a woman's body became a ticking bomb. One wrong moment, one misplaced step, and she could be utterly destroyed. Thus, the concubines devised silent ways to protect themselves. They couldn't directly refuse. Declining an imperial summons was defying the emperor himself, and that meant certain doom. So, they developed covert signals, silent yet urgent codes, passed among them in whispers. One might wear a gold ring on her right hand, a subtle sign that tonight was not suitable. Another might tie a small red string around her sleeve, hoping a clever eunuch would notice and swap her plaque before the emperor saw. Some would dot a tiny red mark on their forehead or cheek, seemingly decorative, but in truth a desperate plea for help. These signs had to be utterly discreet. If discovered, they could be accused of deception or intentionally avoiding favor, losing not only their status, but their honor, branded as disloyal and rebellious. The true tragedy. The final decision rested with men who did not understand or did not care to understand a woman's body. Some eunuchs, understanding these silent cries, might quietly help, but others ignored them on purpose to earn favor with the emperor, no matter the consequences for the innocent woman in their grasp. In some cases, concubines had to deliberately faint or feign serious illness to escape the fateful night of imperial summons. But when the act was exposed, they faced severe accusations, feigning illness, deceit, disrespect, even treason. Every effort to protect their own bodies, in the eyes of the court, could be twisted into a punishable crime. Some older concubines, or those who no longer had any hope of bearing children, chose to live quietly in secluded quarters, avoiding the vicious cycle of sexual summons, a gilded cage disguised under the term imperial favor. But for the young, newly entered into the harem, still yearning for a place in the emperor's heart, they had to both long for selection and tremble in fear for the day actually arrived. In the imperial harem, no choice was safe. Each night, each wooden name plaque drawn, was a gamble between life, death, and honor. And in that very game, women hailed as future mothers of the nation were the most passive, silent, and expendable pieces on the board. In a place where it seemed all one needed was obedience to survive, the Qing imperial harem was in fact a silent, yet brutal arena where a concubine's existence was not determined by love, but by scheming endurance and sheer luck. Each concubine entering the harem became a game piece. Everyone wanted to move forward, but no one knew if the next step would lead to ruin. To survive and, if possible, to rise, they had to learn to navigate in the shadows, where rules were only excuses and survival the only goal. One of the riskiest tricks whispered through the harem was the tactic of stealing the dragon and replacing the phoenix. This meant sending a palace maid who resembled the concubine to take her place in bed with the emperor, a strictly forbidden act, punishable by death for both if discovered. Why resort to such extremes? For many concubines, the days when their bodies were too weak, sick, or menstruating posed serious risks. If summoned during such times and they failed to respond appropriately, they might be scorned, demoted, or exiled, but refusal would mean defying a royal decree. Thus, palace maids, those who lived closely with them, became silent sacrifices. The stand-in accepted the danger, either by force, out of loyalty, or in exchange for a large promised sum. The real concubine took a calculated risk. If successful, she retained imperial favor and honor. If caught, they were both guilty of deceiving the emperor. None would survive. Some even chose to defy the law to seize their future. In the Qing harem, only by conceiving a child with the emperor could a concubine truly change her fate. Because of this, any deliberate attempt to conceive without official permission was strictly forbidden and monitored. After each night of imperial intimacy, eunuchs meticulously inspected whether any dragon's seed had been retained. If there was no official order to grant pregnancy, all evidence had to be cleaned immediately. But some concubines dared to retain the emperor's semen at all costs, avoiding washing, remaining completely still all night, even using folk herbal remedies to enhance fertility. They knew that if they successfully conceived, they could be moved to a separate palace, receive better care, have their own budget, and gain influence within the harem. Even if discovered to be pregnant without imperial permission, the consequences were often more bearable than being forgotten forever like a discarded object. However, to keep their actions secret, many had to bribe the eunuchs, those charged with observing and reporting post-intimacy conditions. The price was steep, and sometimes silence had to be bought with their bodies. Some concubines, driven by desperation, even offered themselves to high-ranking eunuchs in exchange for a chance to be accidentally selected by having their name plaque deliberately placed on top, near the emperor's hand. In return, they fully understood the price. That night would be a dangerous gamble. If they failed to receive imperial favor properly, or if their ambition was exposed, they would be harshly punished. Many were caught retaining semen against orders, or orchestrating a deceitful selection for imperial summons. The usual results: miscarriages, being drugged, interrogated, or exiled never to be mentioned again. All these schemes, replacing oneself with a maid, bribing eunuchs, unauthorized pregnancy, were carried out in silence, in shadows, without sympathy, with only danger and faint hope. Because in the harem, the law was the emperor's, but one's fate was decided by oneself if one dared enough and remained cold enough. These were not the elaborate schemes for favor glamorized in television dramas, but rather raw, deeply human acts of desperation by women who refused to be forgotten, who did not want to waste away in silence for a lifetime. And perhaps the most terrifying thing of all was not these tricks, but the fact that they had to be done just to survive. In the Qing emperor's harem, pregnancy was not just a woman's duty, it was a deadly game. For those concubines who had once received favor, the formation of new life could be the gateway to transformation from a forgotten name to the mother of a prince, and potentially the next empress if fortune smiled. Yet, that same drop of imperial blood, if conceived at the wrong time, in the wrong way, became a death sentence without trial. Every imperial summon was meticulously recorded. The concubine's identity, the time, and the location were all archived in royal records. If a pregnancy followed a legitimate one that was authorized, recorded, and witnessed, then it was reported to the Empress Dowager and the Imperial Household Department, where the woman's health was examined and the pregnancy officially acknowledged as dragon seed. Immediately, that concubine would be moved to a private residence, attended by female physicians and eunuchs around the clock, given a special diet, and placed under strict supervision. The preservation of the fetus became a state duty, not just a personal matter. That unborn child was considered royal property, and the mother thereafter stepped out of mediocrity and entered the grand chessboard of the dynasty. However, all it took was one wrong move, and everything could collapse. Some concubines, driven by survival or ambition, deliberately retained semen after intercourse without receiving imperial permission to conceive. Others secretly met with the emperor outside the official schedule, or colluded with eunuchs to rig the wooden plaque selection. Regardless of the method, if the pregnancy was not recorded by the Imperial Household Department, then the fetus was deemed illegitimate even if it carried royal blood. In some cases, a concubine would deliberately faint or pretend to be seriously ill to avoid the fateful night of imperial summons. But when the deception was uncovered, she faced serious charges, faking illness, deceit, disrespect, even treason. Any attempt to protect her body could be twisted into a punishable offense in the eyes of the court. Some older concubines, or those with no chance of bearing a child, chose to live quietly in isolated quarters, avoiding the cycle of imperial visitations, a cage gilded by the false promise of imperial favor. Yet for the young women newly entering the harem, still yearning for a place in the emperor's heart, they were caught in a terrifying paradox, longing to be selected while fearing the moment when their name would finally be drawn. In the imperial harem, no choice was truly safe. Each night, each wooden name tag was drawn, a wager between life, death, and honor. And in that game, women lauded as the mothers of the nation's future were the most passive, silent, and disposable pieces. Where simple obedience might seem sufficient, the Qing imperial harem was more than that, a silent, ruthless arena where survival didn't depend on love, but on cunning, endurance, and sheer luck. Each concubine entering the court was a pawn. Everyone wanted advancement, but no one knew if the next step might lead into a pit. To survive and possibly rise, they had to maneuver in the shadows, where rules served only as excuses, and survival was the ultimate goal. One of the most daring tricks whispered through the harem was known as switching the dragon for the phoenix. A palace maid who resembled a concubine would take her place during the emperor's visit. It was strictly forbidden, and both women risked execution if discovered. Why risk such a thing? For many concubines, times of illness, fatigue, or menstruation posed grave danger. A summons at the wrong moment could result in disgrace, demotion, or exile. But refusal meant defying a royal command. Therefore, palace maids, those constantly by their side, became silent sacrifices. The stand-in accepted the risk, sometimes out of coercion, loyalty, or a promised reward. The real concubine took a calculated gamble. If the substitution succeeded, she retained imperial favor and honor. If not, both were guilty of deceiving the emperor, and none survived. Others chose to break the rules outright, motivated by ambition and chance. In the Qing harem, only by conceiving with the emperor did a concubine truly gain value. Because of this, any attempt to conceive without approval was strictly forbidden and closely monitored. After every imperial night, eunuchs meticulously checked whether dragon seed had been kept. If no permission to conceive had been issued, all evidence had to be purged immediately. Yet some concubines dared to retain semen at all costs, refusing to wash, lying motionless for hours, even using herbal remedies to enhance fertility. They knew that a successful pregnancy could change everything. They might be relocated to a private palace, receive devoted care, a separate staff, influence within the harem. Even an unauthorized pregnancy was often more bearable than being forgotten forever as a worthless relic. To keep these actions secret, many had to bribe eunuchs, the very men who monitored and reported post-visit conditions. The price was steep, and silence sometimes demanded flesh. Some concubines, driven by desperation, even offered themselves willingly to high-ranking eunuchs in exchange for a chance at being accidentally chosen by having their name tag placed near the emperor's hand. In return, they understood the stakes. That night could make or break them. If imperial favor didn't follow, or their motives were exposed, they faced merciless punishment. Many were caught retaining semen illicitly, or bribing officials to manipulate the name-drawing process. The typical consequences: miscarriage or forced abortion, drugging, interrogation, exile, and total erasure from memory. All such schemes, substitution, bribery, illicit pregnancies, occurred under deep silence, in darkness, with no compassion, only danger and fragile hope. In the harem, the law belonged to the emperor, but fate was decided by the individual if one had the daring and the cold calculation to act. These were not glamorous rivalries as depicted in dramas, but stark desperation: women who refused to be forgotten, who would not spend a lifetime in silence. Perhaps the most chilling reality wasn't the tricks themselves, but that such tactics were necessary merely to survive. In the Qing Emperor's harem, pregnancy wasn't just a biological event, it was a lethal gamble. For favored concubines, a budding life could open a door to distinction from obscurity to the mother of a prince, even empress if fortune favored her. Yet that imperial blood, conceived at the wrong moment, could become a silent death sentence. Every imperial summoning was rigorously documented, the concubine's name, time, and location. A pregnancy that followed a legitimate visit one with a proper decree, record, and witnesses would be reported to the Empress Dowager and Imperial Household Secretariat, the mother's health verified, and the unborn child officially recognized as dragon seed. Immediately, the woman would be moved to a secluded palace, tended to by female physicians and eunuchs day and night, given a special diet and tight oversight. Preserving the fetus was now a state duty, not personal. That child was royal property, and the mother, elevated into the dynasty's grand gambit. Yet a single misstep could mean collapse. Some concubines, driven by ambition or survival, deliberately retained semen after intimately being with the emperor absent any official decree. Others secretly met the emperor outside the scheduled tour, bribed to manipulate the drawing of name tags. In any case, if the pregnancy wasn't recorded with the Imperial Household Department, it was considered illegitimate even if it carried royal blood. Throughout history, there have been many concubines who are not outstanding in appearance, but who rose to the highest ranks thanks to their sharp instincts, sense of timing, humility when necessary, and firmness at the right moments. They knew how to conceal their ambitions, avoid making enemies too early, and most importantly knew when to remain silent and when to speak. They could feign weakness to escape jealous eyes. They could let others take the glory, waiting patiently for the right moment. They were not overly eager to seek favor, but quietly built their own power base, winning over eunuchs, maidservants, and most crucially studying the emperor's temperament, habits, and loneliness. The truth is, even after capturing the emperor's attention, the game was far from over. In the inner palace, being favored was not necessarily a reward, it was often the beginning of a long chain of tragedies. A concubine excessively doted on by the emperor became a target of envy. Others would plot in silence, poisoning her food, spreading malicious rumors. Even the empress, seemingly the most powerful woman, could become a deadly adversary if she felt her position threatened. One careless word could be remembered forever. One unintentional gesture could be twisted into an insult to the Son of Heaven. That is why those who survived long in the palace never let emotions dictate their actions. They played their roles like masterful performers, always cautious in front of others, only revealing their true selves to the utterly loyal. In many cases, beauty itself became a curse. A concubine too beautiful would unsettle the empress and others. Some, upon entering the palace, immediately captivated the emperor only to vanish mysteriously within months, accused of disturbing the inner palace, bewitching the imperial heart, or simply being loved too much. There were those who were exiled to the cold palace, or who fell into the river, accidentally slipped, incidents no one dared investigate. In that world, power and jealousy always walked hand in hand, and beauty, unguarded by intellect, was a double-edged sword. The inner palace was not a place for flowers that only knew how to bloom. It was a shadowy battlefield where intelligence, patience, and the ability to read hearts determined survival. In the thick darkness of schemes and power struggles, the smartest woman didn't need to shine the brightest, she only needed to know when to retreat, when to advance, and when to disappear without a trace. Beauty could earn admiration, but only intelligence could make it last. To the outside world, the imperial harem symbolized power and beauty. But behind the resplendent silks, behind the golden glow spilling through intricately carved windows, was a vast machine built to crush the fates of countless women. These girls entered the palace while still young, some only 13 or 14 years old. A single imperial summons was a cause for celebration in their families and villages, as if their lives were about to turn golden, but no one asked if they wanted it. From the moment they passed through the palace gates, they ceased to be human, they became offerings to the court, goods in a power game in which they had no say. In the eyes of the court, they were concubines, a lovely title, but in truth, chess pieces to be placed, moved, or sacrificed as needed. If favored by the emperor, they might receive blessings and elevate their entire family. If not, they would fade into obscurity, living out their days behind gilded bars, their names never spoken again. Among the hundreds, even thousands, of palace women, only one might be chosen each night. And even that being loved was fleeting. One night of favor might be the only shining moment in an entire lifetime, a brief instant soon replaced by another face, another voice, another scent. The cruelest truth was this: no one knew why they were chosen, and no one knew why they were forgotten. There were no rules guaranteeing love in the palace. No heart strong enough to love many women deeply and truly. In that world, being loved was not a right, it was a privilege, and no one dared demand a privilege. No matter how beautiful or talented a woman was, only with royal blood did a concubine truly have a voice. All respect, envy, and privileges only began from the moment she became pregnant. Not pregnant, then she had no value. No one listened to her words. Her desires were meaningless. A young, beautiful, clever, favored concubine still could not compare to one with a swollen belly, even if her beauty had faded. That was the brutal truth of the inner palace. Only by becoming pregnant did a woman have a temporary chance to escape being crushed by the system. Women in the palace were never silent. They had cried, pleaded, resisted, sworn oaths. But every sound from their lips was like wine passing over stone walls. No status, no children, no favor meant no power. And without power, their voices drowned in laughter, orders, and daily jealousies. Some dared to submit petitions for justice only to be accused of overstepping a woman's place. Some fought back against injustice only to be exiled to the cold palace forever, where no one remembered their names, and history erased them as if they had never lived. Generation after generation, the inner palace continued to churn. More young girls were selected, painted and perfumed, to become ornaments of the dynasty. A few rose to become consorts or empresses. The rest were abandoned, forgotten, and trampled by the very system that once celebrated their arrival. Looking back, we shudder to ask, how many of them ever had dreams of their own? How many ever wanted to love, to be loved, or simply to live as human beings, not as tiny parts of a merciless power machine? The harem was not a paradise, nor a prison. It was a massive grinder, lubricated with the blood, tears, and silence of women. In that world, being loved was a luxury, having a voice was rare, and surviving sometimes was the hardest thing of all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.